this point, I don't care if your food is organic. I want to fight white male supremacy and the violence it foments on the rest of the world. Defeating that would be an indicator of our genuine advancement and illumination as a species. That's our common struggle, and this is the turning point. We can't afford to be siloed. The common struggle is a struggle of the majority of the people in this country against the blueprint for a tyrannical, anti-democratic government. Even at this early stage of the transition phase, for which climate change is an annoyance to be ignored. Climate change is not going to make it onto this administration's priority list, except to dismantle every attempt to mitigate it. In fact, their priorities are simple: maintaining and consolidating power and making money at any cost to the environment, humans, or other species. We have to grapple with that reality. There's an understandable lull, complacency, even impotence that's setting in as most of us struggle to accept the facts and the inevitability of what has happened. But the next 4 years at least may make the post-9/11 years seem a picnic. Yesterday, I said to a friend of mine who's smarter and much more calm than I am, I hate to use the word apocalypse, and he said, oh, I'm using it all the time. I then asked a football-watching friend, a guy I know who never seems to have a care in the world, what he thought of this really great Chiefs-Saints game. I don't know if any of you saw it, and he chastised me for paying attention to something so trivial. There is salvation in the mundane. I always say cook all you can because cooking addresses as many issues in diet, in agriculture, and climate change, and public health as any individual act can. I will admit that watching football does not accomplish any of those things. Life does go on. We should cook. We should continue our good work. We should continue to make progress, even on personal level, to make this a better world. I believe that the standards of pretty much everyone in this room are aligned, and we can mostly agree on what we'd have this world look like in 20 or 50 years. But those visions are way less likely than they were a week ago. So I would say we figure out how to organize to fight for basic rights and for the future not only of democracy but of humanity, because that's what's at stake. It no longer matters who people voted for. And I'm sure many people who voted for Trump had what they thought were legitimate reasons to do so. I don't believe they're all racists, although they all supported a racist, which makes their motive suspect. But in any case, they're a fifth of the population, a minority. They'll be more surprised than most when they see what they've wrought. Some of them will come back to their senses, but regardless, that leaves more than 200 million people with whom we can work. The biggest voting bloc in this country comprises those who didn't vote at all. And if we're going to survive, those people must be engaged in this struggle. It's time to exit the period of competition and enter the period of cooperation. This isn't a new thought. Since 1945, we've been faced with a choice: cooperate or perish. But the choice is even starker, clearer, and in a way more promising now, because it's really between cooperate and thrive or compete and perish. We can cooperate and have a world that's closer to utopia than many of us imagine, or we can continue to battle among ourselves and watch civilization degrade. I'm not saying food is not important. Food's a key factor, not only in climate change, but in energy extraction, species extinction, rainforest destruction, and the chronic disease pandemic. It's a key factor even in income inequality, racism, and sexism, because 8 of the 10 worst paying jobs in the United States are in the food sector, and most of those jobs are held by people of color and women. Food affects everyone, and unlike climate change, which is mostly experienced as weather, it's something everyone engages in and talks about daily. Unlike almost any other contemporary issue, climate change being the exception, I think, food forces us, humans, to look at our role in the world. Humans are especially powerful, and our official entry into the Anthropocene epoch makes that more clear than ever. But as we're continually discovering, other animals are special also. It's no longer wise, and it's increasingly unacceptable to consider other animals inferior, and our relationships with these fellow beings is changing accordingly. Factory farming, for example, is doomed. but not if we allow Donald Trump to rule this country without challenges. When I started my column for the Times about 5 years ago, I noted that the so-called food movement paid more attention to animal welfare than it did to worker welfare. But it's inevitable that the more we learn about animals, the more we recognize their intelligence, the more this informs our relationships with one another. Most people know that it's no longer acceptable, in fact, it's idiotic, to consider other groups of humans inferior, worthy of subjugation or exploitation or murder. It's only wise to recognize one another as different. Just as we're able to see our children as different from us, but a part of the same clan, so should we be able to see our neighbors, people from across the border or across the ocean or from the other side of the planet. I believe, and I'll bet many of you do too, that your feelings about others are different than they were when you were younger. We have made progress. With the understandings that peace is better than war, that cooperation is preferable to competition and equality superior to inequality, that barring greed, there's enough to go around and every human can share in basic rights like housing, healthcare, decent food, and an assurance of safety, and that there are limits to consumption, we can begin to build a world in which health, well-being, education, respect, and cooperation are paramount, and hate, jealousy, greed, and wildly disproportionate wealth are seen as psychotic as 20th century genocides. We do not need to know how to get to the end of this road to embark on it. We can choose reason and support over hatred and fear at every turn. We can rethink how our cities work and make certain that all players have a part in running them. We can build strong, sane communities and use them as examples to build bigger, saner societies. We can consistently choose peace and cooperation over strife. It's not corny to say we can be mindful and gentle with one another. In fact, progress demands that we do so, but our abilities to act this way are threatened. Food, eating, agriculture, nutrition, and so on don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of a web of control that weaves together every major issue you can name and threatens not only to choke off world progress, but lead to extinction. You can call that web of control capitalism, you can call it neoliberalism, you can call it modernism, but contrary to Margaret Thatcher's long accepted dictum that there is no alternative, there is. The present is our best opportunity to dismantle that web and replace it with a system that will allow humanity to thrive. Happily, we've arrived at a time when it's finally become acceptable to talk about these things and to wonder out loud what the alternatives are. Donald Trump will help us do that because his behavior will be not only egregious, but stark. Trump's success comes at the end of a 35-year period that took place while many of us were sleeping and during which Ronald Reagan instituted the neoliberalist policies of cutting taxes on the rich, dismantling the safety net, underfunding education, imprisoning poor people, especially people of color, deregulating and privatizing everything in sight. This is that legacy. Bill Clinton had no answer for it. He triangulated, which meant he moved the Democratic Party to the right. It was a deal with the devil and one that Barack Obama could not undo. We are now either at the end of the end or the beginning of the beginning. Oh, look at that. Excuse me. We are now either at the end of the end or the beginning of the beginning. And because the agreement to limit global warming is likely to be among the first casualties of last week's election, unless you count common decency, there are a few reasons to be optimistic. But one is that Trumpism, a struggle against the inevitable, is doomed. That doesn't mean it can't bring the world down with it, because this is an administration that may well order the use of nuclear weapons, and that's the only quicker way to destroy life as we know it than ignoring climate change. But we're certainly not returning to some mythical past that never existed, in which all Americans were white and all were equal, a ridiculous notion. We're witnessing the death rattle of what might be called the white Republic of America, and this is its last gasp. This is not a normal Republican versus Democratic battle, which would be bad enough, since we'd see regression on every issue that matters. But there was a sense of normalcy even when W was president, and I fear that normalcy is not going to be present now. I hope I'm wrong. But in any case, I do think our primary jobs right now are to demonstrate, to make our voices heard, to build our communities, to build local alternative structures, to share those structures, to take over local and state governments. While we were sleeping and infighting, the allies of Donald Trump took power in the majority of state houses, giving them the abilities to suppress voting rights, pack local courts, and gerrymander to their heart's content. This is the reward. We have to work toward electing real representatives in Washington in 2018, which for those of us who live here or in California may mean picking up and going somewhere else to knock on doors when the time comes, something more of us might have been doing last week, and to show the kind of energy the anti-war, women's, and black power movements showed in the 60s and 70s. As I've said in the last few minutes, we have seen progress in many arenas, including food. Bit by bit, the so-called conventional food system is being dismantled. There are 215 food policy councils established around the country, most of them without federal support. There are more farmers markets than there are McDonald's. Schools are buying more than $1 billion a year in local food, and that benefits both children and farmers. Soda tax is just passed in 5 more cities, including San Francisco, Boulder, and Chicago. But progress on every one of these things is threatened and may be doomed unless all of us get to work building the country and the world that we want to live in. Everyone's saying, this is a nightmare. It isn't a nightmare, it's worse because it's real. In the short term, demonstrating opposition to an autocrat, standing up to bigotry and stupidity are the most important things. Demonstrations are not just feel-good activities, but a way of applying pressure. And as someone said last night, everyone, even the great narcissist, is susceptible to pressure. We should, by the way, also be pressuring President Obama to use his last 60 days to make the boldest moves he can. The election was at least in part about wanting change. I wrote back in July that my fear was that Hillary Clinton would be seen as the candidate of the status quo and that Trump might win just because he was the opposite. A portion of the electorate wants to blow everything up, and to some extent that's understandable. But it isn't only the white working class that's been harmed by NAFTA. It's the black working class as well. It's the immigrant working class. It's the working class and the farmers of Mexico. There are natural alliances here. There are unnatural alliances also, and we must be ready to work with everyone who wants to defend democracy. That will include those Republicans brave enough to stand up to Trump. Democracy itself is at risk. We've made progress since World War II on many fronts, not enough, not fast enough, but some, and now all of that is threatened. This, I think, is the fight of our lives, and everything else has become secondary. Thank you.